to our distinguished guests to day 2 of the 2022 Women in Transport Africa Conference. I know that many of you are logged in from different parts of the world, and so this is good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mbeki Mwalimu. I'm the producer for Back to Basics, a theatre company that strives to bring excellence back to stage. My sign interpreters will be Chris Paul Ndongo and Shadrach Odari Misonga. Now, this conference, this being the 5th annual gathering, it's organized by Flone Initiative to discuss issues pertaining to women and transport, specifically in Africa. We'll be sharing a link and asking you for information, demographic information, and this is just to help us better understand you. So please note, this is voluntary, and it is also anonymous. So please take time, submit your answers, and we'll be glad to have a look at them. We are live on YouTube. We are also very live and interactive on our social media pages, which is at Flone Initiative on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The hashtag we're using this year is WTEA Conference and hashtag Shape the Future. Now, allow me to just give you a small recap of what happened yesterday. We had a very beautiful start of the Women in Transport Conference, yesterday being day 1, and some of the things that were talked about, just very, very briefly, you know, Naomi began by introducing Flone, Naomi being the executive director and founder of Flone Initiative. The opening welcoming address highlighted the conference in part of Flone's movement initiative mandate. Now, 3 keynote speakers wove a thread through the conference, overarching the theme and by the daily sub-themes, lived experiences, research, and solutions. The first speaker was Carla Gonzalez, the Senior Gender and Transport Specialist at the World Bank, representing Almud Wits. The speaker noted that the conference is meant to discuss and plan for rapidly growing African cities and transport systems that are all-inclusive. Women and girls have to be included in the process from the start. Now, the second speaker was Margarita Diaz from the University of Catalonia, and the discussion on mobility for the future. And let me take that again. The second speaker was Margarita Diaz from the University of Catalonia, and she discussed mobility for the future. And now the last keynote speaker was Jody Evans, who noted that the expansion of public transport is vital to resolving the changes women face while using public transport. Now, after the keynote speeches, sessions, deliberations were centered around life experiences of women professionals in the transport sector in Kenya. The various sessions of the day also explored how different users experience and transport system work. Now, Hashita Jamba, Lucy Kehonge, Jacqueline Mauta, Elizabeth Njoki, and Sam Clark gave an overview of the women in transport, a session on how to open street empower women and lead to more equitable street design followed, with presentations from Anne Osler, Judy Bala, Penina Ndegwa, and Seble Samuel and Shirley Chebet. The rest of the day was focused on the current situations in transport in regards to inclusivity. Now, experiences from women cyclists, this is Susan Araka, Mercy Fuende, and Cyprian Odada, were shared with supporting evidence from the Gender and Cycling Report. Now, Faith Njahira, Winnie Owino, and Felicity Mukiro presented the views of persons with disabilities. The last session of the day analyzed the intersection between public transport, data, and gender with presentations from Hashita Jamba, Tai, Judy Ann, and Gada Aziz. Now, back to today. Before I introduce our first session, allow me to just remind you, just like yesterday, we'll be having plenary discussions today and tomorrow, and you can find more details on the program on our website, which is
recording in progress.
womenandtransportafrica.org. That is www.womenandtransportafrica.org. If you need any assistance, if you have any questions during these 2 remaining days, please feel free to ask them on our chat stream. This is in relation to everybody who's joined us both live here at the Stanley and online virtually. We have about 40 people joining us here at the Stanley, and they're looking very lovely and wonderful, and thank you so much for joining us. So even you on our online audience, asanteni sana. For those who don't understand Swahili, asanteni sana is thank you very much in Swahili. Now, without any further ado, allow me to introduce our first speaker today to give the 4th keynote speech, and this is Bastian Schulz. Bastian is from EBAT, Frederick, EBAT, and
Good morning, colleagues, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants of the 5th Women in Transport Africa Conference. My name is Bastian Schulz. I'm the country representative of Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, or FES, here in Kenya, and it's a great pleasure to be with you today, at least virtually. After 2 years of virtual meetings and virtual annual conferences only, I'm quite sure that this year's conference, a hybrid one, feels like a huge success already. I'm very sorry that I cannot be with you in person today and that my short intervention had to be recorded, but I'm not in Nairobi at the moment. And although the transport system in Kenya is quite advanced, there's still existing mobility challenges made it unfortunately impossible for me to attend the conference in person. So as you can see, I'm also sitting in a hotel's lobby. So it's not a lame excuse. It's a matter of fact that unfortunately, I'm not in Nairobi at the moment. I was asked to talk a bit about the future of mobility and how to shape the future of mobility, how to make the public transport system in Kenya and Africa more inclusive and equitable. From my point of view, it's actually highly debatable to what degree the transport systems in Africa and Kenya, in particular, are public. They are, of course, being used by the public, that's for sure, but most often they are neither owned nor designed for the public. But that might be a discussion for another day, but I wanted to make this clear before I use the term public transport actually quite often. So before I dive into the topic of shaping the future of mobility, let me start by expressing my sincere gratitude to Flone Initiative, to the board, the trustees, but especially to Naomi and her fantastic team for not only organizing the annual Women in Transport conference, which has continued to discuss policy and practical solutions to a gender-responsive and socially just public transport. Now, even more importantly, congratulations, Flone, congratulations, Naomi, for another year of effective collective action, of meaningful activities, of numerous policy interventions, even more campaigns, and of course, another year of being what I would call a partner in crime for FES in Kenya, and increasingly also beyond. So the focus on more inclusive and more equitable public transport makes Flone Initiative a natural ally of FES in Kenya. Why? You might ask yourself, why is that? Because I would say our relationship, the relationship between FES and Flone Initiative, is based on a joint vision, the promotion of socially just public transport in Kenya and Africa at large. So you might now ask yourself, why does FES have such a pronounced interest in public transport? And that is because of our, I would call it, flagship program or flagship project, the Just City. We as FES, we at FES, we believe in the concept of a just city, a city that is designed for and run by the many and not the few, a social and inclusive just city, a city that provides all human beings with public goods and services, including public transport, socially just public transport by and for workers in the city. Public transport that is based on actually 5 pillars. So those 5 pillars of what we call socially just public transport are: public transport needs to be available, and therefore it needs to connect the majority of the citizens to the city. Public transport needs to be accessible and affordable, and therefore it needs to be safe and secure for all, not just a few. It needs to be inclusive, and therefore it must not leave anyone behind or exclude anyone, and make the necessary arrangements for people with disabilities, for children, for pregnant women, and the elderly, or the not so young anymore. It needs to be based on human rights and equity, and therefore it must be non-discriminatory. It must be safe, and it must be able to provide decent working conditions for those that are actually providing the transport to the citizens. And finally, it must be, and that's the 5th pillar, it must be sustainable. And therefore, it must meet the needs of the future population and future generations by not polluting the environment. Why do I give you those 5 pillars? Because I was asked to talk about the future of mobility, and ideally, the future of public transport is socially just and therefore based on those 5 pillars. And Flone Initiative is taking the lead on the inclusivity pillar. And I believe that we can even use the recommendations from this conference on advancing the work around the inclusivity pillar. And there is, of course, a very, very strong need to make public transport socially just for women. And therefore, once again, I'm very proud that Flone Initiative is part of the working group. And since I've mentioned the need for socially just public transport by and for workers, I'd like to highlight the need for decent working conditions. I myself, I believe in a direct link between the quality of working conditions and the quality of services provided. If the working conditions of the bus drivers are not good, most likely also the quality of service they provide to you won't be appropriate. And therefore, for us at FES, decent work in public transport systems is non-negotiable, especially, although of course not exclusively, for female workers. Women employment in the public transport sector must be a priority for political decision makers at various levels. And it is, of course, already a priority for Flone and FES. The transport sector remains male-dominated. There are very few women employed in the sector. The great majority of transport drivers and operatives are male, as are those employed in vehicle trades. Women are also underrepresented in professional and managerial positions within the sector or in transport-related public bodies. And therefore, their influence over the decision-making process is very limited. And that is something that needs to change. So I've talked a lot about how do we want to see mobility to develop in the future. But the main problem is that in Nairobi, in Kenya, in East Africa, in Africa at large, but also in other parts of the world, decent working conditions, especially for women, and the 5 pillars of socially just public transport might be non-negotiable for us at FES and our partner organizations, including Flone, but they are very, very far from being a reality for the majority of citizens. So how do we actually shape the future of mobility? Yeah, and the answer seems to be easy, but the consequences are far-reaching. Because at the end of the day, we need to fight for it. It won't be given to us for free. And it won't be given to us just because someone is now interested in public transport to be more inclusive and more equitable. We need to fight for it. So in order for the future of mobility to be inclusive and equitable, in order for it to be socially just, we need to find more ways of supporting those that are in need of such public services, but find it very difficult, if not impossible, to get their voices heard and their interests properly represented. We need to form, we need to initiate, we need to strengthen and to broaden alliances between like-minded organizations. And I think here, once again, the Women in Transport Conference is a much-needed platform. But we also have to build, and even more importantly, alliances between those that might not be aware of their shared interests yet. And I know this sounds a lot like multi-stakeholder dialogues, but unfortunately, those dialogues have a tendency towards ignoring the power imbalances within societies and between various of the so-called stakeholders. So I'd say just simply conducting multi-stake dialogues alone won't change the future of mobility. And therefore, we need to take into consideration the power imbalances. And we have to a certain degree, and that is much easier for Flone than it is for FES, we have to choose sides. Because urbanization in general and transport systems in particular are almost exclusively business-centered. And most often they are neither inclusive nor based on democratic processes. Most city dwellers, or as we call them, the urban invisibles, are being ignored and left behind. Those urban invisibles, the majority of African city dwellers, they live in informal settlements. They work under very precarious conditions, mostly in the informal sector, and they have only very limited access to public services and social protection schemes. And it's exactly those, the most vulnerable, the least privileged ones, the, unfortunately, majority of city dwellers in Africa that we have to support and empower. And I cannot think of a better organization to do so than Flone Initiative. It's actually your determination, it's your creativity, it's your passion and vibrancy that makes you, Naomi, and your amazing team perfectly suited to provide the support that I've talked about. Flone is much needed because it gives voice to the urban invisible. It gives power to them. And at the end of the day, that's one of FES's main goals. And let me conclude by giving you one concrete example. Nakuru City, one of Kenya's 4 cities, Kenya's youngest city. FES, through the Just City Working Group, as well as the Socially Just Public Transport Working Group, is supporting the development of the Nakuru City Vision 2050, which has a very, very precise component, a very specific component on mobility. And we have started to shape this mobility component from a socially just perspective about a year ago, once again in partnership with Flone Initiative. And the executive director, Naomi, is part of the steering committee. And therefore, she has a direct influence on the outcome of the Vision 2050 development process. And therefore, she's actively shaping the future of mobility in Nakuru. And let me conclude by also pointing out that FES is working with various local, but also international partners on the Just City and the Socially Just Public Transport project. We have an MOU with the UN Habitat. We've recently signed an MOU with the Nakuru City County, but we also established a working relationship, for example, with the Nairobi Metropolitan Area Transport Authority, or NAMATA. That's just a few examples, but as you can see, we are engaged in various fields with various partner organizations at various levels. And thanks to Flone and other partners, we are actually able to fill those partnerships with life. So we look forward to what such collaborations, including the cooperation with Flone, could yield in supporting the work around a just city and especially creating impact. Because that's my main message to this year's Women in Transport conference. Impact, it's crucial. It's at the end of the day, it's the ultimate goal. Talking and complaining is easy and it's much needed, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So all of us, we have to take action. We have to translate our various discussions, the pillars, the policy recommendations, as well as the research into action and into meaningful impact. Having said all of this, I wish all of you a successful and a fruitful conference. Once again, Naomi, please accept my apologies